My husband took my business credit card saying he needed my ATM card to pay online. I agreed, telling him it had $800,000 and that he should be careful. The next morning he disappeared with the ATM card, leaving divorce papers on the table. I burst out laughing, thinking mission accomplished. A few hours later. "Where's the ATM card?" Scott said, his voice calm but with a hint of control. I was lying in the hospital, battling cancer, weak and tired from the treatments. His face wore a small, triumphant smile as he took the card, making me feel uneasy. There was something in his look, something that hinted he might have his own plans now that he had my ATM card. "Just so, you know, there's $800,000 in that account. Handle it carefully," I told him, trying to trust him as my husband. I hoped he would be there for me, but I also had a plan in mind. I had thought through everything and decided to trust him, even with this risk. When I got out of the hospital, I went home to pick up some things. But what I found shocked me: a divorce application lying on the table. My heart sank, confirming the fears I had deep down. Scott had taken the ATM card, along with everything we had built together. But rather than feeling defeated, I saw this as the beginning of my own plan to fight back. I'm surely a woman in my 50s, and this is my story. When I first married Scott, I thought I had a wonderful husband. He seemed kind and caring. For the first 3 months, our marriage was smooth, but things changed quickly. His true colors began to show. Scott acted as if he believed that a wife should always put her husband first, no matter what. This attitude slowly revealed a darker side to his personality. He became harsh and demanding, using his words as weapons. His favorite saying was, "A wife should always listen to her husband." Whenever I didn't follow his exact wishes, he would lash out, calling me names and making me feel like a failure. He even had specific demands about household chores. He insisted I wash his clothes separately and clean his room first before anything else in the house, no matter how busy or tired I was. Even meals became part of his demands. He would say, "A wife's job is to make what her husband wants." Yet, sometimes he would eat the food I made, not because he didn't like it but because he wasn't in the mood, without even telling me beforehand. I was frustrated and exhausted by his behavior. It felt like I was always walking on eggshells, trying to please him but never succeeding. Each mistake I made would make things worse at home, adding to the tension between us. Living in this way was draining me. One day, while doing the endless chores he demanded, I felt dizzy and lost consciousness. I collapsed with a loud noise that startled our neighbor. They called the building manager, who came to check on me and immediately called an ambulance. I woke up in the hospital, finally realizing just how much stress and exhaustion I had endured. In that moment, I knew it was time for me to take control. As soon as I arrived at the hospital, they admitted me for tests. I hoped they wouldn't find anything serious, but my hopes quickly faded. The doctors diagnosed me with cancer, and it hit me hard. I wasn't sure if it was caused by stress, but I knew I was in a terrible state. I felt so dizzy that I could barely stand, and a nurse had to hold me up and help me sit down. The doctor suggested I contact my family, so I tried calling my parents. However, my mother had passed away a few years back, and my father now lived with my brother and his wife, 5 hours away by plane. It wasn't possible for them to come quickly. Feeling helpless, I decided to call my husband, Scott. I left him a message, but he didn't respond. It seemed like he had turned off notifications for messages from me, so he might not see it right away. The doctor advised me not to try getting my things from home by myself, so I let go of the idea even though I needed a change of clothes and some toiletries. Hours later, Scott finally sent me a brief message saying, "I'll come to the hospital tomorrow. Wait for me." His message felt cold and uncaring, and I wondered if he would even bring my things with him. I had already asked Scott multiple times to bring my belongings that day, but he hadn't responded. My need was urgent as I had nothing with me in the hospital. After hours of worry and waiting, he finally read my messages and sent a shocking reply, "Shut up and be quiet." His response was so hurtful, especially knowing I was hospitalized and dealing with a cancer diagnosis. I felt disappointed, but I shouldn't have been surprised. Scott had never shown much care, but part of me still held on to a little hope. The first day in the hospital was rough, made worse by Scott's lack of support. The nurses saw my distress and tried to comfort me, but their kindness only made me feel worse, like a reminder of what was missing in my marriage. The next day, around noon, Scott finally showed up. He looked at me and said casually, "You look healthier than I thought. I expected you to be more frail." His comment hurt, and I couldn't hold back my anger. "Just put down the bags and leave," I told him, trying to stay calm. Scott looked confused. "What bags?" he asked, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. My frustration grew. He hadn't even brought my things after I'd clearly told him I needed them. I glared at him, unable to hide my anger. He noticed my look and snapped. "What's that look for?" His indifference was pushing me to my limit, but I took a deep breath and tried to stay composed. "If you didn't bring my things, why are you here?" I asked, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. Scott responded to my angry question with a casual, "I had another errand." "Another errand? What was so important?" I asked, feeling exhausted and drained after a sleepless, stressful night. I waited, watching him hesitate as if he was deciding whether to tell me the truth. "If you have something to say it now," I insisted. Finally, he let out a small laugh and said, "Where's the ATM card? Let me manage it. Trust me." His real purpose became clear in that moment. He had come here not out of concern for me, but to get control of the ATM card and seize our savings for himself. His self-centeredness, even in this situation, made me feel a deep sadness, yet Scott stood there smiling as if nothing was wrong. Unable to bear his behavior anymore, I made a decision. "There's $800,000 in that account," I told him firmly. "Take care of it." Scott's eyes lit up with surprise and greed. To give some background, both Scott and I had worked regular office jobs before we got married, and we didn't make much money back then. So, where did this $800,000 come from? The answer was stocks. After I became a housewife, I started investing in the stock market on a friend's advice. I did this quietly while taking care of the house, and recently I had made a large profit. Initially, I wanted to keep this money hidden, afraid of what Scott might do if he found out about it. But now, my desire for revenge drove me to tell him. Seeing his greedy reaction confirmed my suspicions. "The ATM card is in the third drawer of the shelf," I said with a gentle smile. "Go ahead. Take it." Scott looked stunned, but he quickly regained his composure. "Understood," he replied with enthusiasm. It was clear he thought he was winning, not realizing he was stepping right into my trap. "I'll leave everything to you," I said as he left the room, clearly excited to get his hands on the money. What he didn't know was that withdrawing such a large sum would take time. The banks were closed that day for a holiday, and Scott had work the next morning, which meant he couldn't access the money right away. This gave me the perfect opportunity to carry out my plan. I spoke with my doctor and got permission to leave the hospital briefly. Tomorrow would be the day I set my revenge in motion. I could barely wait. The next day, I went home under the excuse of picking up some belongings, but my real reason was to check on something else. As I entered the living room, I noticed 3 papers lying on the table, a divorce application, and a hastily written letter. The letter read, "Sorry for the rush, but let's get divorced. Please sign and submit the divorce papers." I checked the shelf and confirmed my suspicion. The ATM card was gone. Scott had taken it. Most people would feel devastated to lose such a large sum, but instead, I felt a small smile creep onto my face. "Operation successful," I whispered to myself. If Scott had been there, he would have been furious, demanding to know what I meant. I started by filling out the divorce application, putting an official end to our relationship. Then, I packed the essentials I needed for my stay in the hospital. Leaving the house we had shared for years felt strange, but I didn't look back. On my way out, I submitted the divorce application, making sure our ties were truly cut. Back at the hospital, I prepared for the new challenges ahead, speaking with my doctor about my treatment and what I should expect. Later, while resting in my hospital room, I noticed multiple missed calls on my phone, all from Scott. He had also sent several messages, mostly asking about how to withdraw the money. To avoid disturbing my roommate, I stepped into the hospital's common area, where phone calls were allowed, and returned his call. "Finally, I can't withdraw the money. Please tell me how to do it," Scott said, sounding more panicked than I had imagined. It seemed he needed the $800,000 urgently, but I felt no need to help him. "If you can't withdraw it, then give up," I replied, keeping my voice calm and cold. "Don't be so harsh," he pleaded. "We were husband and wife after all. Maybe we should help each other." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Husband and wife. Helping each other? His words felt like nonsense. Scott's actions had shown he only cared about himself, and I knew he was driven by nothing but greed. "Are you really having trouble withdrawing the money?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Yes," he answered, sounding desperate. "I urgently need that $800,000. Please, just tell me what to do." Hearing him so desperate was something new. It was almost amusing to hear him, usually so controlling, sounding so cornered. I almost laughed, but I kept myself composed and decided to give him the truth. "The method you're trying is correct," I told him, letting the words sink in. "But the ATM card you have now, it won't work anymore." There was silence on the other end as he processed what I had said. The card he had taken would no longer give him access to the money. I could imagine the shock on his face as he realized he had fallen right into my plan. I spoke plainly. "The card won't work anymore," I said, hearing the disbelief in Scott's voice. "What do you mean?" He shot back. "An ATM card should just work." "Yes. Normally it would," I replied, "but the one you took is now useless." "Why?" he demanded, sounding both shocked and frustrated. "Because I filed a report for a stolen card earlier today. The ATM card is now just a piece of plastic, useless to you," I explained calmly. There was silence on the other end as he tried to absorb the news. That morning, I had stopped by the bank and reported the card as stolen. Scott had taken it without my permission, planning to take the $800,000 I had saved up for himself. His actions were clear theft, and I had every right to protect my money. Now, the card he had was blocked, and he could no longer access any of those funds. On top of that, I had already submitted the divorce papers, ending any claim he might have thought he had as my husband. "How does it feel to be outsmarted by the woman you always looked down on?" I couldn't help but add with a sense of satisfaction, "I don't know what you needed the $800,000 for, but I'm not about to hand over that money under these circumstances." Desperation filled his voice. "I need that money right now. Please, I'll do anything. Just give me the money." His urgency was almost overwhelming, and I felt a sense of curiosity. What had he done that made him so desperate for such a large sum? "Why do you suddenly need $800,000? What's going on?" I asked, waiting for his answer. After a long pause, Scott started explaining. 3 days ago, when he learned about the $800,000, he impulsively quit his job. Expecting that he would have access to my savings, he started spending recklessly, even gambling, and quickly ran up a debt of $600,000. Now, the lenders were demanding that he repay the debt within a week, or there would be severe consequences. He had assumed he could solve everything with my ATM card, convinced the money was already his. Scott went on, telling me how he had been living lavishly, assuming that once he had the card, he'd be set for life. But when he tried to withdraw the money, he realized the card was blocked. Now, without access to the $800,000, he was in deep trouble. "My future is in ruins without that money," Scott admitted, his voice full of desperation. He had abandoned the divorce papers he once left on the table and, shamelessly, reached out to me for help, hoping I'd feel sorry for him. But after everything he had done, I felt no pity for him. Scott's voice shook with fear. "I don't know what will happen if this continues," he said, sounding truly panicked. It was clear he wasn't lying. His reckless actions had finally caught up with him. He had gone wild, spending $600,000 in just a few days, blinded by the thought of easy money. I sighed deeply. The old me, the one who had once put up with his terrible behavior and tried to keep the peace, might have felt sorry for him and offered help. But I was different now. The love I once felt for Scott was long gone, replaced with a sense of indifference. No matter how much he begged, I felt no pity. If anything, I felt a faint amusement that he thought I'd care enough to bail him out. But Scott kept pleading. "Please, you're the only one I have left," he begged. His constant appeals grated on my nerves. I wanted to free myself from this burden and focus on my recovery. This mess was entirely his doing, and I had no reason to help. If you had shown even a bit of concern for me as a husband and brought me my things when I asked, maybe I would have considered sharing some of the $800,000 with you, I told him, but you didn't. You only thought about yourself. I kept my tone firm. I'm sorry, but I have no intention of giving you the $800,000 or helping you out of this mess. It's your responsibility to deal with the consequences. Scott's desperation grew. Don't be so cruel. We were married, after all. You can't just erase everything we had because of one piece of paper. What relationship? I shot back, my voice sharp. You've only leaned on me, taking advantage whenever it suited you. Now, you're trying to manipulate me to get what you want. I refuse to waste any more time on you, and I won't give you the $800,000 no matter what you say. Scott's voice became frantic. Please, Shirley, I'm begging you. You're the only person I can turn to. If you abandon me, I don't know what will happen. His words had a tone of blame, as if somehow I was at fault for his situation. But the truth was clear. His own careless spending had led him here. If he hadn't splurged recklessly, if he hadn't cut me out of his plans, he wouldn't be in this mess. This was entirely his doing. Stop making excuses, I replied, my voice steady and cold. You're just facing the consequences of your own choices. Handle it yourself. With that, I ended the conversation, feeling a weight lift for my shoulders. Scott had dug this hole, and now he would have to find his own way out. For once, I was free to focus on myself and my own healing. I ended the call with a firm final message to Scott. When he kept calling back, I ignored him and eventually blocked his number to stop any further communication. With the divorce papers filed and submitted, Scott and I were no longer connected in any way. I was officially free from him. Feeling a sense of relief, I turned my attention fully to fighting cancer. It was a tough journey filled with treatments and struggles, but I finally overcame it. When I was discharged from the hospital, I felt like a new person, ready to start fresh. After leaving the hospital, I heard from a friend that Scott had disappeared. Desperate after losing contact with me and not being able to access any money, he had tried borrowing from his family and friends. He begged them for $600,000, but his urgent pleas made people suspicious, and no one was willing to lend him a cent. What happened to him after that was unknown to me, but it seemed he was going through more hardship than he ever expected. Knowing this brought me a sense of closure and satisfaction. After recovering, I decided to leave the house I once shared with Scott. I found a new place to live, one that felt peaceful and entirely my own. I also began working from home, enjoying the independence and freedom that came with this new phase of life. My finances were secure, and I felt grateful to have control over my life again. Sometimes friends would ask me if I planned to find new love or consider remarrying. The memories of my painful time with Scott quickly put an end to any thoughts of marriage. I had learned to value my freedom, and I loved the peace of living on my own. In my new home, I felt at ease and at peace, with a fresh start ahead.